mute. And your tables and seats are in the upright position.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for all attending. And do we have anybody virtually?
Mr. Chair, good morning. You've got Director McClinton that has joined you virtually.
Thank you. And I'd just like to state my name is Ben Martman, and I'm chairing the committee of the Governance Select, which is here to review and make recommendations to the Board of Directors on governance processes. And items will include what's on today's agenda, which is a code of conduct, but also later on we'll talk about the term length of committee chairpersons and vice chairs, roles and responsibilities, remuneration, expense policies, and meeting procedures, and perhaps other things as well. Before we get going, I'd just like to make an acknowledgement that we're coming from the traditional and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish and Nuu-chah-nulth peoples. And I think Mr. Robbins has always asked people to put things on mute or all their electronic devices. I'd like to welcome Alternate Director Champ for Area B. And are there any regrets for today?
Director Segal, Manhas, and Staples.
Great. And so as we start this meeting, I'd like Mr. Robbins to take us on out.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Good morning to everybody. First on your agenda, just the approval of the agenda as circulated. There are no additions that we're aware of.
Motion to approve. And seconded. And all in favor? Any opposed? Carried.
And adoption of the minutes of the committee of the governments, it should be the governments committee meeting on February 22, 2023.
Any errors or omissions? Hearing none. All those in favor? Approved and seconded. I saw those. And any all in favor? And those opposed? Carried.
We're not aware of any business arising from those minutes, which brings you to public input period. Opportunity for the public to comment on an agenda item before this committee. I don't have anybody online, but we do have somebody here in the boardroom.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and hardworking staff who support all of you. My name is Kim Bernard. I'm from Shawelican, Shawnigan Lake, and I'm here as a very keen community volunteer as of 2018, doing community cleanups, and also volunteering with CVRD-related committees such as the Solid Waste Management Amendment and the CVRD Recreation for Shawnigan Lake for a couple of years. So I am here because of today's topic. I'm keenly interested in how governance works, how the CVRD at its highest level with the highest expectations of community engagement and governance is expected to operate. And so maybe you can understand that it breaks my heart that I see a disconnect in my community, and I'm here to hopefully understand and learn what the processes are, how to make things better, how to fix things, how to encourage dialogue and not feel avoided and shunned for this past year as I have been. And I think that all of the wording and description should lead to collaboration, should lead to positive outcomes. And so, again, I stand as a member of the public hoping to learn today from what's expected and how things can be resolved. And I'm delighted to report that today is World Water Day, and in celebration of that, the Shawnigan Basin Society is holding a a walk that's open to all on the Coxsila River, and I hope to be walking shoulder to shoulder with many of the important voices in our community and learning from them how to care for our environment and how to care for each other so that we all remain in relationship, and as our Hulkaminum speaking friends, we're closely connected and caring for one another. So thank you very much, board and chair and staff.
Thank you, Ms. Bernard. Ms. Robbins.
Moving through your agenda right through to agenda item 8, which is reports. The only report on your agenda today is a report from Human Resource Division with regards to the Code of Conduct for Elected Officials policy. Ms. Mohan is here to speak to it.
Thank you, Mr. Robbins. And Ms. Mohan, I just want to acknowledge the work done on this already and appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to the committee, I am here acting as the sort of HR representative when in fact it is Ian Peidel who's our HR manager, but he's on vacation right now. But as you probably, some of you will recognize from the history in this report, this was a portfolio with which I was intimately familiar in my prior role. And so I'm going to just give you an overview of what you see before you today in the package, and then I understand there's probably lots of discussion and questions, and I'm happy to field those. So the purpose of this report was to take direction from this committee to use the City of Nanaimo's Code of Conduct bylaw as a template for a code of conduct policy for this group. And so I want to point out right at the beginning that what Nanaimo has is a bylaw and what is in front of you is a policy, and that was intentional. And it is up to this group to decide whether or not a policy is sufficient to the needs of this committee or whether or not they would like to make this a bylaw. So that's step one. The other thing that has been incorporated into this policy are the learnings that this group and staff have taken away from recent sessions at the LGLA and also at the UBCM, and also learnings from the initial policy that we put into place and our reliance on it over the last term and how we would like to see that improved. So a key point in this package is the introduction of the idea of an ethics commissioner. And so, again, City of Nanaimo has chosen to go the route of engaging an ethics commissioner and has done this appointment by bylaw. So there's a draft bylaw in your package should you decide to appoint an ethics commissioner. So an ethics commissioner in the context of this package is explained under financial considerations a little bit. So one of the more challenging pieces that happens when there is a complaint under a code of conduct policy is the act of getting both the complainant and the respondent to agree on who will review and investigate the complaint. And that process itself can take a long time for both parties to agree. So one of the things that is suggested here that might be advantageous is to identify in advance and appoint an ethics commissioner so that when complaints arise under the policy, that step is already sort of taken care of. And so there's lots of information in here about that. Usually an ethics commissioner is someone who is either currently or in the past practiced as a labor lawyer or an arbitrator or a mediator, and that person has usually put themselves out there in service to investigations such as this. And so this is someone who could be identified in advance and held on a contract as needed basis. So they would only be engaged in work when and if there was a complaint underway. And then there's some provision in this report for what to do if that person's unavailable, or what to do if a complaint arises before someone's appointed or in between the terms of appointment, et cetera. So in which case there's provision for the CAO to engage a commissioner on an ad hoc basis, and that would just be a similar process to what we've engaged in the past, where the complainant and the respondent would likely need to agree on that person to adjudicate the complaint, or investigate the complaint. So I think that's the extent of my introduction of this. I think it's a much more detailed document than what we had before, but I think it reflects the evolution of code of conducts for elected officials, which have been a hot topic in the last 4 years, and it reflects sort of the evolution of need around more detail on procedure, more detail on potential consequences, and so City of Nanaimo's bylaw is a good example of everything you might want to include in a code of conduct policy. So.
Thank you, Ms. Mohan. Any questions? Director Wilson.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm leaning in as far as I can here. Thanks, Ms. Mohan. And I think the members of the board did get a document from me yesterday which summarised more or less some of the concerns that I have here. And this is going to take a little bit of time, so I appreciate it if you would bear with me for the time being. I don't see anything here, Ms. Mohan, that allows a resident to file a complaint. Is that something that we should be including here? Because as was pointed out just now, there was mention of that, that perhaps there was no way that a resident could bring forward a concern that they had about things that may be happening in their particular area.
Yes, so I'm going to point out a couple of things in the policy draft. So if you look on page 3 of the draft, Article 1.3 application, this part of the policy outlines, who it applies to, and it's in essence, this policy only applies to elected officials in terms of their dealings with staff, other elected officials, appointees of various commissions, et cetera, by the board. It doesn't particularly govern the conduct of elected officials with the public. And the reason for that is that the avenues for complaint and resolution when the public has issue with the behavior of elected officials are not ones that are within the jurisdiction of the CVRD to hear or decide. So currently, if a member of the public has an issue with an elected official, their recourse, it extends to a number of different provincial offices. So hang on just a second. And so they can contact the Inspector of Municipalities, the Office of the Information and Privacy Commissioner, the Office of the Ombudsperson, the Office of the Auditor General, and the courts or the police. So those are the avenues that the public has for complaint against the conduct of elected officials. There is a sort of a principle in this document that says that even though the jurisdiction of the CVRD doesn't extend to hearing complaints and adjudicating complaints from the public, there is still elected officials are still asked to act in the spirit of this code whenever they're dealing with anybody. And that includes, it specifically addresses spaces where the public might see the communication, like social media spaces or making public comments. So while it does govern, it does, expect that elected officials conduct themselves according to this policy in all aspects of their role, it doesn't extend to procedures for receiving or adjudicating complaints from the public.
Yeah, that explains it well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Barbara. And follow up, please, sir. And this is only, as I heard you say, is for elected officials, and that doesn't, one of the questions I asked, whether this extended to alternates and members of the area planning commissions, etc. They're not elected, but they are, in effect, confirmed by the board as part of that. So this would not include the alternates, etc.
No, it does include them. So if you
Okay.
look in the policy, there's a couple of places where they're included. So hang on a sec.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, I must have missed that bit, so I apologise for that. But if it's there, then
Well, I would like to point it out just so that everybody
Yeah,
knows.
great,
So
yeah.
under definitions, item 1.2.3, it defines what a committee member is. So the word committee member appears throughout the document, and a committee member is a person appointed to a committee, subcommittee, task force, commission, board, or other board-established body. So a committee member does include someone who would be appointed to an area parks commission or a planning commission, for instance. The other thing is that there is other language in the policy around, this policy extends to anyone who may act in place of a board member, and that would cover the alternates, essentially. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sure there's others who have questions, so I'll yield for the time being, but I do have some more if it's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else have questions? Director Abbott and then McGonigal.
Thank you, Chair. I highlighted Ms. Monahan. I highlighted interactions with staff, volunteers, and committee members, item 3.21. I wondered whether this could be clarified a little bit more. I get the intent, but interacting with staff, we should be directing our queries to the CAO, where unless the issue is of a general nature. It's come up a couple of times where some of the managers are on holiday. And so I wondered whether perhaps an addendum, an appendice could be something along the lines of an organization chart, so we know, especially for new directors, we know who to turn to on issues that, for instance, right now, Brian Farquhar is away, so who do I address a parks question? So I'm getting into the weeds, but I just,
No,
it
that's a
just
good
sense
question.
that one could be fleshed out a little bit.
So I think that it may not need to be in the policy, but I take your comment, and I think that it's incumbent upon staff to make sure that if they're away, that people who are trying to contact them know who to contact in their stead. So normally, if the contact is by email or voicemail, they're going to redirect you to who you should contact. But especially because we're getting to be quite a large organization, I think it's reasonable that staff can come up with maybe not an org chart, but something along the lines of, if you have an inquiry about this is who you contact, and this is who their alternate is if they're not available, that kind of thing. So, and I noticed the CAO is raising her hand, so she also has a comment, I believe.
Yeah, so just following up on that question, Director Abbott, we can definitely provide a bit more information about that and make sure that there's good process for staff, like as Ms. Mohan said, notifying of who who's acting for them. But I would say in those instances, just contact me, and I can easily guide you to who is save yourself some time, right? If there's a lot of, as Ms. Mohan said, there's a lot of people that in this organization who may be on vacation or away, and that's what I'm here for. Just give me a call or email, and I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Danielle. Ms. Miles Wilson. I didn't want to bring up dog bags and litter containers on pathways in Cowichan Bay, but thank you for the opportunity.
So I'm not seeing the reference to code of conduct with those? Am I missing something? I think so. Director McGonigal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and way to get that in there, Director Abbott. I will try not to myself. Through you, if I may, Mr. Chair, you spoke of a ad hoc commission appointment. I'm wondering if within our current legal context, if that would be accompanied in the purview of that contract that is already in place with our current legal team.
That's a good question. So right now we have for our human resources or labor relations legal support, we have a longstanding relationship with a particular legal firm and lawyer who I think was part of your orientation, Marcia McNeil, with Pulver Crawford Monroe. And so that longstanding relationship benefits us because she has an organizational history, but we are under no obligation to use her for every instance. And so typically what happens is that she advises the organization. And so if you have a complaint between a complainant and a respondent, and you need someone to investigate that complaint, and it makes more sense for her to be in a role of advising us on procedural matters and how to proceed with results and those kinds of things, especially in the absence of the detail that's now in this draft policy. But the actual person who investigates and conducts interviews and creates the reporting at the end of the process is usually someone that has to be agreed to by the respondent and the complainant. And so to predetermine that it's going to be the labor lawyer for the CVRD is not always sufficient. And so it makes sense that as a group you would agree on who that commissioner is in advance, and then you don't have to have that conversation when the time comes. So.
And a follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair. And I'm thinking along the lines of the current contract that is already in place, having that person appointed as the ethics commissioner by this body, if they so intend. Anyone who has gone through the process of an investigation knows the expense of that and how that can be culminated in the process moving forward. To delay the process even extends that financial constraint. I'm just thinking that if there's a current contract for legal advice within the labor section of the law, why we would not think of appointing that as the ethics commissioner.
Sorry, was that a question or? No, okay.
Thank you, Director McGonigal, and Director Stone.
Yeah, just building on that, I don't think that we should rule out our existing advisory firm from serving in that role, but I think it might be worth at the front end of this, upon the adoption of a policy, that we put some kind of a request for expression of interest or whatever the appropriate mechanism is to get that person appointed. And it may, not to exclude any existing firms that we work with, but to you know, sort of look for people that may be interested in it, and then the committee and the board can make a decision to appoint that person. But I think that what's highlighted here is both the cost, so that would be part of what will the cost be, what's your hourly rate for these kinds of appointments, whether there would be some kind of an annual retainer to keep them on and ready should a complaint come forward, and yeah, then the board can make that decision, make that appointment relatively swiftly. But I hope that it never, you know, we never need to, right? But I think that, you know, I think part of me when reading this is sort of sad that we have to, right? But I think that in today's political climate, whether it's internally or externally, you know, I think we're seeing, you know, more patterns of behavior. I think, you know, and I just, you know, while I was searching different codes of conduct and stuff, news articles are coming up all over the province, and even saw some commentary last night that somebody said, you know, this was about municipal councils, and there are a few noteworthy ones already this term, crazier than ever, or something to that effect. And the commentary was, I'm not quite sure yet, but so far it seems like maybe that's the case. Thankfully, I feel like here we're on going in the other direction, trying to work more collaboratively, and this is just more of a backstop to me, to sort of as a protection for everyone involved. But speaking directly on this piece, I like the informal process. I think that hopefully an informal process where there's dialogue and discussion is, you know, would be ultimately the outcome of any complaint. Not necessarily needing to go to the ethics commissioner or the commissioner, however we term their role here. But I do want to thank staff for the work on this. I think the items pointed out so far have been really thoughtful. But I think so far as a framework, it's a great policy, and I was really impressed by it in comparing with other ones around the province and more broadly. So thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may? Just to respond on the appointment of an ethics commissioner, I didn't presume to suggest that we couldn't use our existing labor support. We may find, if we ask around, that, you know, as Director Stone pointed out, availability might be a concern, costs might be something you want to look at. So, but we certainly wouldn't exclude her from consideration. That's fine. The other thing that I think that we have sometimes faced is that we've been fortunate in that these kinds of issues haven't come up frequently for us in the past, but when they do come up, they are expensive. And so rather than like budget every year for them, one of the things that is not addressed in the report, but is certainly something we could consider, is setting up a kind of a legal reserve or something like that, so that there were funds set aside in the event that a complaint arose that required legal support, but that it wasn't something that we had to, you know, a reserve instead of an annual kind of budget.
Thank you. And just a comment about Director Stone about the, you know, the need of this and, you know, should we need it. But I just think back to my family and growing up and having my elbows knocked because they were sticking out too far at the dinner table. The code of conducts, you know, we set them down as families. And I think that's really what we're establishing here as a family, is what we think is right. So over to Director Morrison.
Are we into comments or still strictly into questions? I have a few comments, Mr. Chair.
I'd like to stick to questions and then do a roundtable of comments.
Well, then I'll pose this question. in the preamble, and I'm going to comment a little bit here. So I've read this a couple of times, and I've been at other tables where code of conduct's being discussed, and we have a code of conduct in place that admittedly could be tweaked and updated. But in reading the preamble, elected officials are keepers of the public trust and must uphold the highest standards of ethical behavior in order to build and inspire the public. Whose ethics are we talking about here? I think we are supposed to be upholding the highest standards of behavior, but whose ethics? I look at this and I'm just saying that as part of my commentary, that I'm getting a sense that the pendulum on this issue has swung a little far to one side. And so I just look at that word ethical and it just jumped out in that my ethics are different from your ethics and everybody else's ethics. Why aren't we talking about the highest standards of behavior? So I'm not comfortable with how far this is going at this point, but can you tell me where this word ethical came from in this document? Ms. Mohan.
I can only say that this document was taken directly from City of Nanaimo. But on the topic of ethics, so there are codes of ethics that are associated with different professional positions. I'm not sure, maybe the CAO can comment, I'm not sure if I know there's one for the Local Government Management Association, for instance, because I just took my ethics training, so there's actually a code of ethics as a local government professional that I have to read and train on and acknowledge every year, and it's quite clear what that ethical code is. It's not really a relative document. It is a standardized document for the profession. I'm not sure if such a document exists through LGLA for elected officials. Are you aware?
So, I mean, I'm not aware of a document that that would be defining this, but we can define it.
I mean, this is the document.
Yeah,
That's
so
what you're choosing right now, is this standard of behavior, is that the ethical
We could
behavior you want?
expand on this, Director Morrison. I guess that would be my commentary, is that, ethics are principles, as Ms. Mohan said, attached to a position or a defined body of work. And in this case, we're talking about governance and local government specifically. So we could expand on the definition to say ethical behavior expected of local government officials or something to that regard, or we can actually define it in the code of conduct, what we're comfortable with this document representing. So we could do a bit of work on that, is I guess what I'm suggesting.
If I could follow up, this is a code of conduct, not a code of ethics.
Yeah.
And the document is about our behavior and interaction and how we deal with one another and staff and the likes. I think it'd take a workshop to figure out what the ethics of this board is. I'm more inclined to suggest that the word be deleted as opposed to expanded. So putting it out there, and there's examples of this through the document. And so I'm suggesting a good deep look into this. Thank you.
So noted, and I guess the other thing we could look at are the principles that are outlined within the UBCM guidance document. So that would be like ethics are principles in effect. So we could reflect some of the industry best practices, I suggest, in defining the behavior.
Director Nicholson.
Thank you. I am looking for clarification on the complaint procedures. So when I look at 4.11, confidential requests, there are 2 bullets related to that. So just to be, so that this does not preclude you doing an informally trying to resolve a problem that you have with, for example, another director's behavior. outside of this, but this is once you decide that it is not resolvable with the two of you, and tell me if I'm correct in making these assumptions, then you have the option of making a confidential request anonymously or not to the commissioner who would attempt to address your concerns with the other board member, with or without you, I suppose. And then if that is not satisfactory, you would go to a formal complaint written procedure. And you have the option of going straight to a formal complaint written procedure if you so want. Now, do I have this right?
So the way I understand it, is that under confidential requests, someone could make a complaint or register a concern with the ethics commissioner. That can't be anonymous. So I don't think any procedure ever deals with anonymous complaints. So it wouldn't be anonymous in that the ethics commissioner would know who you were, right, your identity. But there would be confidentiality, i.e. that person could speak with the person being complained against and keep the complainant's identity confidential. So there's kind of a trusted advisor sort of role that the ethics commissioner could play, where they could speak to them about a complaint that they'd received without a formal process and without a need to reveal who the complaint came from. So that's the confidential requests. Once there's an actual complaint, there's still an option of resolving it formally through an investigation or resolving it informally at the request of the complainant, is how I read this.
So my concern is that when I read my concern is, when I was doing this, I kept going back to, and I keep getting myself lost as a result. I keep going back to the Forging the Path for Responsible Conduct document. And they stress over and over again that it is so important that the process is perceived as fair, and that if you can resolve things informally, it's more likely to be a positive outcome than if you end up going down the formal complaint process. And so I am thinking about how, and I get that this is a policy and it's not in a bylaw, which I like. I think that every time something like this comes up, it is very context specific and it's very complicated. And as we've talked about already, things evolve in our community. And I'm thinking now, more and more we're expected to deal with more cultural diversity, and there's going to be more probably offended parties unless we really choose to work on collaboratively working together in a positive way. So the more I think that our policy can reflect the fact that we really expect people to be able to try and work these things out, and with help, I think is a good idea, and it also saves a lot of money if we can do that. So I would like the policy to really focus on doing that. And I'm not sure that the wording right now is clear enough for me.
Okay, I was going to say,
uncomfortable.
I think that maybe what we are looking at is more of a style of expression issue, because basically it identifies a process for an informal complaint. It identifies a process for a formal complaint, but an informal resolution, and then it identifies a process for a formal complaint and a formal resolution. So it's all covered, but certainly staff could take direction if the board wished to make a statement in this policy around the importance of, or the preference for, or the exploring first of informal avenues for resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to respond to the director's questions and comments on this as well, because within the document and the process itself, we're actually encouraging training throughout the course of the year. And I think that that's an excellent topic that we could focus on, is trying to provide some tools and resources to directors on how to resolve things more informally and dealing with issues as they arise rather than having them escalate. So that, I think that's just something we can work into our standard practices, trying to give people those tools, because we're not all born with those tools. We have to kind of learn them along the way. So that's something that staff can help organize.
Thank you. Anything further, Director Nicholson?
I guess I think it would be helpful to have something that is more of a statement in the policy about that. And I also think this could be clarified a little bit. I was
Clear?
confused when I read it.
Director Staples?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree that we should make sure that that's very clear, that having gone through that process, or not seeing it gone through, to make sure it's very, very clear that the first thing that we do is start off with trying to work it out and trying to, whether there's a mediator involved or not, depending on the situation. But I think that that's key. And the training, I think that that's something that all of us can always benefit from, is training. My question, though, is how do we make something like that mandatory for attendance for everyone? Because we can do all the training, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people that that people will take part in that. And I know with elected officials that's hard. So how do we do that in a policy as an expectation of everyone around the table, that we all do take part in that? So that's my question.
Through the chair, responding to the director's questions, an example on the management side is our requirement as members of the Local Government Management Association to take 2 hours of ethics training annually, right? So that is a new thing. I think they've only really instituted that in the last couple of years, which is indicative of what's going on in the world. So there are those types of things that we could do and set those expectations for ourselves, and the board could for itself.
Okay. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just to respond in terms of compelling someone, I don't think you really can. I mean, as a group of people working together, you can compel each other by mutual agreement. The chair has some role, but really there's no way, because you're not employees, there's no way to force you to take any particular training. So.
And so, rather than force. But
Yeah, but I mean, you can't compel someone.
Yeah.
You really don't have you don't have a whole lot of tools other than your working relationship, your mutual trust, your mutual agreement on things. You can establish a policy. I mean, you can, if you want to embed it in the policy, but then there might be repercussions if you don't follow the policy, I suppose. But yeah, it's a difficult question. You need to really all be on the same page. And by that token, if someone's uninterested in training, it's compelling them to attend is unlikely to be a good way for them to learn the information anyways.
So, I mean, that's something I think as the board, when we sign on to this document too, that should be really clear that we're expected to follow through with those things, and that's the agreement that we have, and that's maybe something that outside of the policy, and because I don't know if it could go into a policy, but how are we willing to hold ourselves and each other accountable to this as well? So I don't have an answer for that. That's just something to think about.
Thank you. Director Stone?
Yeah, I'm making notes of some of the stuff that's being discussed because I think it's all relevant and it's all helpful, I think, to customizing this policy so that it fits this body, but still provides the necessary framework. I'm just thinking about like a desire for training. I'd love to continue to build my knowledge base and my effectiveness, because when we think about this as a backstop policy, hopefully it's never necessary. It's more about becoming more effective in the roles that we serve. So if we look at it through that lens, there's a few ways, I think, without sort of stepping outside our jurisdiction. We can't compel a fellow elected official to do much of anything, except for within the policies and procedures that we have. So the question, I guess, is, and it's not that I would want to go there, but in the policy itself, it could outline the annual provided training. And again, recognizing that it's only to help us become more effective in doing our jobs. And I think that my experience has been that those who operate within guidelines like these, either naturally or by training, typically seem to be more effective at getting their points across and helping shape policy. So if we want to be effective local government officials, we should probably be excited about those training opportunities, right? So when I think of enforcing that training, if it were outlined within the code of conduct policy, then, and again, this is a question, maybe we can't answer it today, but if it were included that 2 hours be provided by the organization each year, or whatever that number is, 2 workshops a year or something, keeping us on a path of good governance, and there's a habitual lack of willingness to take part, that in itself could be a code of conduct violation. Is that within our purview? Because it seems to me that it would be. If we can write a code of conduct, then we can set a baseline of expectations, just like coming to a meeting, right? You miss a certain number of meetings, there's legislative remedies for those issues, but if we're being empowered to adopt a code of conduct, perhaps we can lay out the training that's provided, and I think that gives more validity to the policy, because then it shows that you're actually providing the skills necessary to be a good governing official. So that's just a thought, but I do have to say that I do really appreciate the commentary so far. I really like the preference for informal resolution as a statement that outlines sort of our values. And I do take Director Morrison's point on the repeated word of ethics. When I'm looking online at most of the documentation available, it's sort of under a subheading of ethics, right? These codes of conduct, good governance, all belong under sort of a government's ethical responsibilities, or a local leader's ethical responsibilities. But I don't think it's necessary to have it in the document, right? Because we are talking about a code of conduct. So I would be supportive of changing the wording if that makes them uncomfortable, or defining it in a way that is acceptable to the group. Thanks.
Thank you, Director Stone and Director Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, there's some really good points being brought up here, and I'm really happy to see some of the things that go on. Unfortunately, I get very uncomfortable when I hear the words mandatory or force or compel. It doesn't sit well with me at all. So I would say, yes, of course, training is good, but we shouldn't be compelled to do anything like that. I will attend, of course I will attend, but let's not make it so restrictive that you must. There may be times when you won't be able to. But anyway, I'll leave that as the time being. The section 416.2, and there is a subject to inclusion, a period of 10 days for a respondent submission. That's not really very long for anyone to respond to a complaint. And I think the other timeline standards are more like 21 days. I would like to see the 10 days extended to 21 days and retain the phrase commissioner's discretion to extend. The 10 days really is to me not long enough. Believe me, I've been through it. It's not long enough.
So at this juncture, I've taken a lot of notes. There's a lot of really great suggestions coming. So far, there's not been debate, i.e. there hasn't been someone's suggestion that someone else has said, no, I don't agree with that, we can't have that, other than maybe your comment right now about compelling, but still acknowledging that there's a need to have something about training in the policy, and that might be welcome. So I don't know with this group whether Mr. Chair, whether you want to take that all as feedback, or whether you want to express these in resolutions as staff direction, or it's a lot of great feedback, and like I said, we're taking notes. I think we can make changes that have been suggested, but it's not clear to me whether that's the will of the entire group, I guess. Yeah.
Director Wilson, did you have a follow-up, or?
On that particular subject, no. On the 21 days, I would hope that we can come to some agreement on extending that to a certain extent. And one of the other questions that I have here is about the election period. Mm-hmm. Could we clarify that one, please, Ms. Mohan?
Yes. Through the chair to Director Wilson, that was a good question. I don't have an answer right away for that one. You've identified that the word period is vague, and we need to make it clear. So I will do some research and make sure we bring you a draft where that's abundantly clear. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's great.
Thank you. And just before we go to Director Stone, I think Director Stone just summarized a lot of our comments earlier, which saved me some work. I won't repeat it, but I think, yes, we need to move to where we can give Ms. Mohan some direction.
So I guess this is a question to Ms. Mohan. Like, I think we have this on video. Hopefully our microphones are working. I started making notes about how we could draft a resolution, and I think it's really up to the committee whether we're comfortable. Like, I don't have any issue with any issue that was brought forward in terms of this draft code. I'm really supportive of some kind of a opening statement in the policy that really speaks to sort of the overarching preference for informal resolution. I'm supportive of the change to 21 days, because I think that, you know, if someone does want to seek some legal advice and support, 10 days is hardly enough time to both retain a lawyer, get the meeting set, review all the materials, and submit a response. So I think that's good. You know, I don't think that, you know, as Director Morrison said, I don't think the word ethics is required within the policy. I think in that overarching statement, it can talk about how we speak to our conduct, without sort of creating the specter of my ethics versus your ethics or versus anyone else's. I think this all fits under sort of an overarching umbrella of ethics in general. I'm quite comfortable sort of leaving the discussion as the information, and I think it may be more effective with the remaining time we have today to say, if we're all in sort of agreement that good points have been brought up, that we can ask staff to reflect on that and sort of bring us an updated draft for the next meeting, if possible. I know timing, but we also have a deadline, I think, at the end of April. But also to just maybe get any sort of last-minute sticking pieces on the floor before we hopefully wrap up in the next 10 minutes or so. No pressure. Not 21 minutes, 10. Thanks.
So just before we go to Director Morrison, or Director Nicholson, and then Director Morrison, and then we'll do a roundtable.
I guess I agree with Director Stone on how we should move forward on this, and I would like to have some more discussion about, I'm kind of working through the document into adjudication and reporting now, so I have some questions about that.
Okay.
Or need for clarification, I guess. And I think I need to talk a little bit more, just as a heads up, about the, about the, I keep going back to this forging the path, and they talk about the code of conduct. Enforcement is a complex process, and its outcomes can be significant, so it's important to give considerable thought. And it's not something that, it's a new practice in BC to put it in your code of conduct. So I get that we're copying Nanaimo by and large, but I think that we need to be really sure we understand what the wording means, and I don't find it very clear, so I would like to spend a little bit of time on that. So maybe you could just talk to it first. Would that make sense?
Through the chair to Director Nicholson, so I didn't prepare this document, so I think it would really be Ian who would need to look at that. But what I would encourage you to do at this juncture is that if there's portions that are not clear, just maybe to send your questions to him, because it sounds to me like it's a little bit about wordsmithing and making what's there clear, not so much that the substantiveness of it needs to change. So I'm not sure, either that or I just think we're going to be running out of time if we look at the individual clauses and get into discussion about the words in those clauses. We can certainly reconvene this afternoon. That was one of the identified options at agenda setting, that we could always recess and come back to it. But another option would be just to send questions about clarity to Ian, and then he could revise the document wording to make it more clear.
Can I follow up?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things, so just to clarify, first of all, if you do a formal complaint procedure, the commissioner goes away, they do the report on a confidential basis, and then they submit their report. And so that report, where does it go?
That's a good question. I don't. What does it say?
It says, well, I think it's delivers the report to the complainant and the board
Oh,
and to the respondent.
yes, and I believe the respondent gets it in advance, right? The respondent has it in for a little while before the complainant receives it, I think, right?
The board gets it 48 hours after delivery to the respondent.
So it goes to the respondent, who has some time with it. And that's important, especially if there is a finding against the respondent. And then it goes to the complainant and the board. And then ultimately, depending on the consequences, it's released to the public, I believe. And before it's released to the public, it goes through kind of a privacy assessment, and parts are redacted that don't need to be, out there for public consumption, so.
Okay, so from my perspective, the communication, we need to discuss more about this, what goes to the public and what doesn't go to the public. And when we say board, we mean everyone on the board, not just the.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Because I think that's important, because it's a big cost to do these things. And so I think the board needs to be aware of, what's going on.
Okay.
And so then when we get into reporting to the public, this is where it kind of overlaps with and I can't remember the word when you, no, when you, when you penalize someone for something.
Censure? Are you thinking of censure?
Yeah, well, censure is one way to provide a
Consequence?
consequence, that's the word I want. So the report out to the public in itself can be a consequence, depending on what's in the report. And it's also, the report needs to be really clear, because sometimes the complaints, I think, can be complicated, and there can be more than one complaint, or more than one circumstance in there, and one, you could find one that's not egregious and one that is, and then there's this whole level of how bad is this actual complaint or not. And I think to be fair to everyone, it's really important that the board has an opportunity to receive the report and think about what makes the most sense before anything goes public. So I want to make sure that is taken into account. Yeah.
Okay.
I have a sense we're going to be discussing this further. But I think maybe one of the things that might be useful is an algorithm that would show the pathways for different processes, so that it would be clear.
So do you mean a diagram that someone could?
A flow chart.
A flow chart, okay.
Yeah, sorry, that's my term. Director Stone, I think you're eating your mic there, so go ahead.
Yeah, and reading through this, I think that Director Nicholson's point is well-founded, and I think it goes to this, there may be, I don't want to minimize anything here, but a minor complaint where the complainant is not happy with an informal resolution process that wants to go to a formal process, but without the board's discretion to say, listen, there might be a minor penalty levied against the respondent because they couldn't come to an acceptable resolution informally, but is there a necessity to report that to the public, right? So I wonder if there's an opportunity to insert a mechanism there. And this kind of speaks, I'm going to use the word, a vexatious complaint too, right? So, the scale of interpretation of the injury to the injured party to the might be looked at by the board as saying, okay, well, yeah, we agree that the outcome here was that the respondent was found guilty of the offense, but on the scale of severity, is this really necessary to go into the newspapers? Because that's what happens, right? So I think there does need to be that checkpoint where before public release that the board is able to consider it. Anyway, I do support that, because I think that, as awful as these things are to try and adjudicate as a board, to sort of delegate that authority to make that decision, I think I'm not quite comfortable with either.
Okay. Through the chair, so I've recorded this part of the discussion as as with the others, in hearing no objection, we'll take that as direction to look at that aspect of the report and see if we can make it clearer and also insert some discretionary powers for the board in terms of making things public, is what I'm hearing, right? Okay. I do have a couple other questions that are kind of core to proceeding with a next draft.
Perhaps,
And I have a follow-up real quick.
and I have Director Morrison too, so I'd like to just go to Director Morrison first, and maybe you can wrap up after a follow-up?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And just in my perspective here, that this is weaseling into the nature of how we are doing our job, and I'm looking at 2.12 and 2.13. I've got issues with having due regard with others' perspectives. I think I know what that means, but we're now getting, this isn't ready for prime time, I'm sorry. So we need to do some more work, and I'll stop there.
Director Stone.
Thanks for the setup. So in that vein, I think we have made some good commentary, and I think we've made good sense in terms of reflecting on this policy and how it fits our organization. My perspective is that's probably enough for today to work through and look at another draft. It's up to the committee whether we want to reconvene later this afternoon and sort of keep going on it. But I see a fairly substantial little chunk of reflection on this to be incorporated in updated draft. And if we're okay, if the chair and the committee is okay with that, I would suggest that, obviously we do have a timeline to meet. But I don't know, and this is a question through to staff, if we thought incorporating some of the feedback from today could be brought back at our next day of meetings. So we could have another governance committee meeting with some updates. I'm not sure when Ian is back.
He's back next week, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a question through to the CAO and Ms. Mohan. If we think that we could leave it there for today, bring back a draft, get some time to reflect, I would support the feedback that if there's specific questions around vague wording or specific, more pointed definitions, they could be emailed. And then it would be the judgment of Ian whether those were incorporated to that next draft. And then we could look at it then and sort of workshop through it a little bit more at the next meeting and hopefully get closer.
I can respond just briefly through the chair. I'm happy to work with Ms. Mohan and support her in Ian's absence to try to fast track it as much as we can. So we'll do our level best to get everything incorporated, but I'll refrain from saying we absolutely will have it all complete, but we'll work as quickly as we can to get it done.
Thank you. And Ms. Mohan, before we we'll just do a quick wrap after you. No. Ms. Mohan next first, okay, thanks.
Okay. So one of the key questions here was, this is presented to you as a policy. Its original form is a bylaw. I heard comments today from Director Nicholson around preference that it remain a policy. It helps in terms of crafting the document to know whether or not that's the sentiment of the entire board, that it should remain a policy at this point. So that's question number one.
Well, let's answer that one right now. So those are, and sort of, I guess I'm not going to put a motion out there. I'm just going to shop around for answers, for direction. Yeah. Go ahead. Okay. Yep. So are those, are we in favor of going ahead with a policy? The general group. Okay. Those opposed? None opposed? Not even online? Okay. So policy it is.
So policy it is. And then the second question through you, Mr. Chair, is just there's a draft bylaw here for an ethics commissioner. So an ethics commissioner is actually an identified role, I think, under the Local Government Act that you actually appoint. And so that would need to be a bylaw. And is there appetite to go in that direction at this time? Are people, do they all want an ethics commissioner, or do we want to reserve that for a future discussion, or? Yeah.
So, I think, let's not put the cart before the horse.
Okay. Well,
That's a farmer in me coming out.
Yeah, so the policy does, the policy itself mentions an ethics commissioner, right? And the role of an ethics commissioner. So it kind of suggests you're going to have one. And if in that case, what we could do is we could draft the example bylaw in the formatting for our organization and present it as a subsequent draft at the next meeting, so.
Yeah, and fair enough. I'm just concerned of time, but it may not be the word ethics in front of the word commissioner.
I understand.
So,
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. So anyways, so Director Wilson, one last quick question. That's it.
Yeah, more a comment,
Okay.
and yeah, I'm glad this question of the ethics has come up because, you know, just I have ethics. Everybody has ethics, but they don't necessarily. Some intertwine, some don't. So I would much prefer to see the word ethics taken out to a certain extent. And really, this is about conflict resolution. So it'd be more than a code of conduct and conflict resolution training rather than ethics training. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. So we're very quickly going to move into another meeting, so thank you, everyone. But just so you know, maybe just Mr. Robbins to wrap up. You can take us through the rest of this. But also, just a quick comment, if you may, on that we are meeting the needs of the reporting to the government.
It would appear in terms of, I'm just looking at the schedule for the month of April, it looks like you can with another meeting prior to Committee of the Whole at the beginning of April. And if there's still some tweaks, then you have the Committee of the Whole 2 weeks after that. And any recommendations can go to the board right away and you'd meet your obligations by the end of the month. And with that, that moves you to question period. An opportunity for the public to ask the chair of the committee questions.
Ms. Bernard.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. I will reintroduce myself as an appointed member of the CVRD Solid Waste Management Plan Monitoring Advisory Group. And so my question is two-part. With the situation I find myself in as someone who has a broken relationship with my elected official, I'm wondering if I can count on the processes that have been described today, that it can be resolved informally through the CVRD, possibly mediated as well. I don't know the process. And if that's not possible, then through the chair to Ms. Mohan, can I get a copy of who I'm supposed to speak to at the provincial level to have my concerns addressed? And thank you, because I don't want to go the route that Director Stone suggested through the media. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, and return to the CAO for a response.
Yeah, so through the chair, I'm happy to follow up with you offline about your avenues. But I think for the purposes of this meeting, discussing the code of conduct for the elected officials, that's kind of the purpose of their discussion. But I am happy to follow up with you offline here about what you can, what avenue you can pursue.
Grateful, with all due respect to everyone and all the work that you do.
Mr. Chair, that moves you to adjournment.
Motion to adjourn. Seconded? And did I get a seconder? All in favor? Opposed? Carried.